everyone, and welcome to part 2 of week 3's material for Introduction to Sociology. My name is Instructor Glenn, and today we're going to be discussing qualitative and quantitative research, social science sampling, and population. And then at the end, we're going to do a brief activity to assess what you've learned about the difference between qualitative and quantitative research. So settle in, grab a drink, a snack, get your notebook, and get ready to listen and take some notes. Okay, so the reason why social scientists actually do research and study what we do is because there are a lot of claims that are made about social life that may or may not be substantiated. And so when we're making claims about social life and the people who inhabit our social world, we really must take great care to make sure that the claims that we're making are based off of our best knowledge of what that world actually is and how it functions and how the people in it function together. The way that we can do that is through comprehensive research methodology. Research methodology is the branch of social research, but also study, that focuses on how we can best try to conduct our research in a way that really helps us to understand what is going on. And so one of the very first important things to know about sociological research and research methodology is that one of the most common things that people tend to do when making claims about the social world is they tend to fall into one of a few kind of social reasoning errors. And so one of those errors that people tend to fall into is that they may mistake the relationship between correlation and causation. What do I mean by this? Well, whenever we want to understand how something happens, a social phenomenon, right? What we usually want to know is what effect something has on something else. This is quite common to broader research, and so it may sound familiar, but this is called your dependent and your independent variable. Your independent variable does not change. Your dependent variable might change. Your independent variable may or may not have an effect on your dependent variable, and that's what you want to measure and understand. And so to take this out of the abstract and make it more sociological, you may want to do a study for a city government on the relationship between poverty and crime. And so you might do that study and find that there is a direct correlational relationship between poverty and crime, meaning that if you were to map poverty and crime on a graph, poverty and crime would typically tend to increase together. And so I can actually draw this out for you so that you can have a better idea of what this looks like. But another way to say this is that poverty and crime, if you were to find this correlation, would have a direct relationship. And so if poverty was your independent variable and crime was your dependent variable, then your graph might look something like this. And so if you were to only look at those two variables, you might start to begin to make inferences off of this data based on the assumption that, well, poverty causes crime. However, that might actually be an incorrect or illogical assumption to make based on these findings. And the reason for this is simply because two variables are correlated doesn't necessarily mean that they are causational. So simply because they appear to increase together, that's correlation, doesn't mean that the increase in both is driven by the same thing, or the increase in one drives the increase in the other. And so another way to kind of try to explain this and suss this out might be to say perhaps there is a spurious or underlying variable in this relationship that is coming in and potentially having an effect on these two factors in such a way that makes them seem like they're increasing together, but actually it's an outside variable that's coming in and causing an increase in both. And so therefore, it's not that poverty causes crime, if we go back to our original example. It's that there may be some external variable that's coming in and influencing the increase in both poverty and crime. And so if we were to think about what that variable might be, it could be something like a decrease in social welfare benefits that impacts poor communities in such a way that causes poverty to increase. Because if you have less benefits going to poor families that need them to help them stay afloat, then you're also going to have more people within that community potentially turning to crime and other illicit activities such as drug sales, right, and use in order to cope with the effects of increasing poverty. And so the difference between correlation and causation is that correlation means that two variables increase together. Causation means that one variable causes the increase in another. Often people mix this up. The important part to remember is that there is likely always many spurious variables that can come in and impact that relationship in various ways. So you have to try to think outside the box past what is right in front of you when you're thinking about these relationships in order to truly understand what could really be impacting these trends that you're observing. The second thing that it's important to remember when talking and thinking about sociology research methods is the difference between a population and a sample. And so when researchers want to conduct original research, they'll often take a sample of an overall population. A sample is simply a small slice of the overall pie. So if we think about it this way, the population is everyone that is in the category you are interested in studying. And so if your research question, or the question that you are attempting to answer with your research, is what are the experiences of homeless Hispanic men living in San Francisco? Pretty specific, right? Then your target population, the overall group from which you're going to draw to understand the people in your study and to understand this overall group, is going to be all homeless Hispanic men in San Francisco. However, it's not possible to interview all homeless Hispanic men in San Francisco. It would be cost prohibitive. It would take one researcher or even a team of researchers decades and you probably wouldn't be able to find a lot of people. You couldn't follow up with them because they had no permanent address. There are a number of practical issues related to the research. And so what you would do instead, the next best thing would be to take a sample or a slice of that overall population. And so the people that you select to be in your study from the total number of people that could potentially fit into the category you're interested in studying is called your sample. And so an example of a sample from our previous example of homeless Hispanic men in San Francisco may be that you choose to interview 100 homeless Hispanic men in San Francisco out of all of these individuals that fit this criteria in that specific place. Okay? And so one thing is, the larger the study sample is, the larger that number is, the n, the more likely that is going to need to be randomly selected or otherwise chosen to maximize the likelihood that it's going to be representative of the overall population. Smaller sample studies don't tend to try to claim to be representative of the overall population. However, larger sample studies, which tend to be statistical studies, are more likely to be used to make claims that affect large numbers of people. Okay, so let's do a brief exercise with populations and samples. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say out loud a group, and then you can say on your end whether or not it's a population or a sample. Are you ready? Okay, here we go. The first example is 250 women who work at Walmarts around the country. Is this a population or a sample? If you said sample, you would be correct because it is 250 women out of the total of all women who work at Walmarts around the country. Number 2, Muslim Americans. Is this a population or a sample? If you said population, you are correct because it didn't give a specific number of individuals, which would be a sample, and it's referring to a broader group of individuals in American life. What about this? Every inmate in one minimum security prison. Is this a population or a sample? This is a tricky one, right? Because it depends on what the group is that you're interested in studying. If you are seeking to understand or make claims about inmates in all of the United States, then every inmate in one minimum security prison may represent a sample, as a slice of all inmates in the United States. However, if you're simply trying to understand life in one individual prison, as sort of a case study, per se, then every inmate in that prison may actually represent your total population. So that one, every inmate in one minimum security prison, could very well be population or sample depending upon what your research question is. Let's do one more. 35 Native American single mothers living on one reservation. Is this a population or a sample? If you said sample, you are correct. So 35 Native American single mothers living on one reservation. If you were seeking to understand the experiences of Native American single mothers in the United States, this would be a sample, a smaller piece of the pie drawn from the broader whole. Good. The third part of this video that I want you to focus on is the broad categorical difference between what we refer to as quantitative research in sociology and qualitative research in sociology. And so I'll start with quantitative research. In quantitative research, which tends to be larger scale studies, often funded by major government and organizational groups, often statistical studies, what we see is that we have very large n's or sample sizes, more often meant to claim representativeness of the overall population of the country. And in these studies, what we tend to see is that they focus more on getting a broad array of responses to a set number of relatively superficial questions, typically demographic questions, not always yes or no questions, but certainly questions that can usually be answered in brief 1 or 2 word responses. And so one way to talk about quantitative research is that its strength comes in numbers in terms of its population sizes, but its weaknesses come in terms of when you have a very large population size with a large number of individuals, it's hard to go very in-depth and get a very deep and rich understanding of things like the motivations and the feelings and the experiences of each one of those individuals. And so these types of studies tend to be heavily statistical. They focus on surveys and using large data sets to understand wide-scale population trends in the U.S. today. And they seek to answer questions having to do with relationships between variables, frequency of events, duration of phenomena, and counts of different groups of people who occupy different spaces in society, and how those groups relate in terms of their numbers, but also perhaps their broader scale experiences in the whole to other groups in society. And so a good example of a kind of quantitative research question would be, how many men in the United States are unemployed? Another good question may be, what is the recidivism rate by county in the United States? Recidivism means when people are sent to jail or prison and then they are paroled, but then they end up having to go back to jail or prison because they've committed a crime again. And so that act of recommitting that crime is called recidivism. And so a major quantitative research focus is based on the rates of various social behaviors like recidivism that we can observe in the whole and parse out amongst different groups or in different geographic areas. Another example of a quantitative research question could be, what is the relationship between having a college education and finding a job? And so what you could do in that kind of study is to look at the numbers of individuals in the U.S. who have a college degree, what type of college degree do they have, and then you could look at how that correlates to those individuals' success at finding careers, and then you could look at what types of careers those individuals have found in order to really understand the effects of college education attainment on job attainment. So statistical studies can be used to answer a large number of important questions. Quantitative or statistical studies tend to have a large sample size. The N is often an uppercase N and can be in the hundreds or even thousands, which is theoretically meant to increase the representativeness of this data. So a good example of this may be census data that is collected every 10 years by the U.S. Census Bureau and used to understand wide-scale trends in demographic data such as race, class, and gender in the United States today. The other broad category of social research that we tend to focus on in sociology is qualitative research. Whereas quantitative research is very broad scale, very seeks to be representative, focuses on the macro level of society or the large level of society, qualitative research tends to focus more on the micro or the everyday interactional level of society. And so qualitative research tends to take an in-depth personal investigation into day-to-day social phenomena. And for that reason, it tends to have smaller sample sizes and tends to look at one place as opposed to many as sort of case study approach. And in that way, it really focuses on bringing a rich and deep understanding of social life at the micro level, feelings, experiences, beliefs, and individual actions. These are the strengths of qualitative sociology. Qualitative methods include observing, participating, interviewing, and surveying. And qualitative methods seek to answer questions that often begin with why and how. Often qualitative studies include quotations from people who are interviewed and include a narrative quality that is like reading a story. And so a great example of a qualitative study that's been conducted is the book Sidewalks by Mitchell Dunier, which is ethnography of Mitchell Dunier, the sociologist's time that he spent living and interacting on the streets with homeless men in Greenwich Village who illegally sold books on the street to survive, books and other items. And so there were many insights into this otherwise very marginalized and stigmatized social group that Mitchell Dunier was able to glean from conducting this very insightful and deep ethnography. One of those insights was that individuals who are homeless have to come up with creative ways to do the things that all of us have to do every day. One of those things is going to the bathroom. In places where there are public indecency laws that prevent public urination, often what we see is that local businesses will make it impossible for individuals who are homeless to use their restrooms. And then that creates a situation in which homeless people have to go to the bathroom in dumpsters or come up with other creative ways to go to the bathroom without being caught, because they could actually be arrested for going to the bathroom, a natural process that all of us have to do every day. And so there are many ways that the individuals in the study talked about using the bathroom, going to the bathroom, having to figure out creatively how to do that without being arrested for doing so. That an incredible insight that would have never been even found if Dunier had not even done that research. So qualitative research really answers deep why and how questions about social life that may actually go unanswered otherwise. And so it's a very important counterpart to quantitative sociology. And so just as a brief recap, quantitative sociology, quantitative research methods, tends to take a large sample, often very broad. It's often generalized to the larger population. It typically uses statistical methods and focuses on broad-scale social trends. Whereas qualitative research methods tend to have a smaller sample, are more in-depth at the micro level of social life, are very personal, and focus on sometimes very personal aspects of social life, and involve conducting interviews and observations to create narratives of those lives of individuals to allow them to speak for themselves. Now that you've listened to this lecture on research methodology, you've learned the difference between a population and a sample, and you've learned the difference between quantitative and qualitative research, you can complete your activity for this week, which is labeled Qual or Quant, and this is going to help you to create a better understanding for yourself of the differences between qualitative and quantitative research using real-life examples of both. This concludes our lecture for today. Please tune in next time for Week 4's materials on social inequality, class inequality, and getting into racial inequality. Again, I'm Instructor Glenn, and thank you for listening.